This is a clip of what is currently my best run of the Atrium 1 time trial in Mirror's Edge. I've fully memorized the layout of this place and optimized my movement to the best of my ability, using every tool at my disposal to save time, like tucking my legs in on certain jumps so that I don't get caught on ledges and railings, and turning into a side dodge to reach my top speed in an instant. There's still room for improvement here, but I feel this clip demonstrates the design and mechanics of Mirror's Edge best, and represents some of the most fun I've had with the game. A portion of a level that was once an upward spiral through a construction site, a platforming puzzle that you had to solve, becomes an utterly enthralling racetrack that makes brilliant use of both the abilities you've come to have an intimate understanding of, and how the level design of Mirror's Edge inherently serves a dual purpose. The game first blends chase sequences, encounters, and puzzle solving seamlessly, in a manner not dissimilar from a linear shooter like Half-Life. This gives players a taste of how good it feels to earn a sense of speed, outrunning enemies and choppers whilst also figuring out how they can use their moveset to overcome obstacles. If you want to chase that feeling, that rush of dopamine that comes from playing the game well, that's when Mirror's Edge truly opens up. Upon playing the game again and studying level segments and chunks across time trials, as well as attempting the speedrun mode, you'll go beyond the initial appeal of figuring the game out on the fly, to the point where you become Faith, and move as she would. All that's left is to do it all as fast as possible. Ultimately, not everyone was able to fully appreciate the game's dual purpose. On an initial playthrough, you will run into a lot of trial and error, combat scenarios where it feels like you have no choice but to disarm enemies, and puzzling moments both in combat and in level design that will stop you dead in your tracks. It almost feels as though the game's flow state is dictated by prior knowledge of what is coming. And that's because it is. I kept coming back to Mirror's Edge as the years went by. For one thing, I wanted to continue attempting the time trials and generally improving at the game, because I felt such an incredible rush after reaching some level of consistency in each level. But what was equally as compelling to me as the gameplay was its world. The laws in place that birthed the runner phenomenon. The intense totalitarian level of control in place in its city, to the point where all color has been stripped away and is reserved solely for corporations and advertising. The lighting solution in place to make those colors pop and bounce off of the bare, lifeless walls. And of course, the engrossing electronic score by Solar Fields, which helps to make the city in Mirror's Edge, as well as the manner in which you traverse it, come alive. In such a hopeless world as the one depicted in Mirror's Edge, a world not too visually dissimilar from our own, runners have attained true freedom. Because of this, I'm not surprised Mirror's Edge became a cult classic. It had its fans at launch, but it also understandably faced legitimate criticism from those that really only felt the need to play through the game once. Even so, they admired its world and gameplay, and saw promise in its originality. Only now that 15 years have passed, and we received a sequel that didn't quite leave the same impact, am I confident in saying that Mirror's Edge is quite simply one of my favorite games of all time. In spite of its flaws, I deeply admire everything about it. It's actually become a recurring joke among my friends to see how long I can go without mentioning how much I love the game. I talk about it a lot. My love for Mirror's Edge encompasses pretty much all of its elements, and I wanted to break down every little thing that I adore about it front to back. I also wanted to touch upon its sequel and why it didn't live up to the original for me, the potential that lay in its foundation, and why the original game's place in the industry is so important. I'm Liam Triforce, and this is a video about why I love Mirror's Edge. To begin, I want to talk about my first exposure to the game back in 2008. At the EB Games in my local mall, they had TVs on the walls and ceilings playing trailers for upcoming games, one of them being Mirror's Edge. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, and it tapped into my fascination with freerunning in film and as a sport. Its art direction compelled me, its gameplay seemed to evoke a power fantasy that I always had growing up. Have you ever sat in the backseat of the car and looked out the window imagining a little dude jumping and vaulting over everything that passes you by? I always wanted to be that little dude. I mean, the Raimi Spider-Man movies were coming out during the most important years of my childhood. I wanted to swing between skyscrapers. Parkour was the closest thing I could get to doing that without having superpowers. It was freeing, it was empowering. Imagining it made me feel like I could do anything. Mirror's Edge gave me an outlet to explore that fantasy. I didn't have any way of playing it until a few years later, though. Mirror's Edge was one of the first games I bought for my PS3, along with Black Ops and Uncharted 1. Good times.
Once the city used to pulse with energy, dirty and dangerous, but alive and wonderful. Now, it's something else.
What compelled me most about Mirror's Edge going into it, beyond the tools at my disposal and freerunning, was its world and Faith's place in it. In a not so far off future, in a city not too dissimilar from ours, surveillance is at an all-time high, crime at an all-time low. Privacy is a non-existent notion. Most accepted the changes as they were gradually introduced. Life seemed glamorous and comfortable to those that conformed. Those that weren't comfortable protested these changes, upon which they were criminalized. Runners exist to deliver information outside of city surveillance, preserving what should be a basic human right, and existing between the gloss of the city and the reality that lay beneath the surface, hence the game's title, The Mirror's Edge. An extremely compelling premise for a game, and a grounded story about a reality that is believable and relatable. Though we as human beings retain privacy as a human right to some extent, technology has given corporations frankly disgusting levels of telemetry and surveillance over our actions. Where we are going, what we are looking at on the internet, to the point where advertisements are tailored to unconscious browsing habits, as if advertisers have psychologically profiled us without even knowing. Rihanna Pratchett, the game's writer, once stated that the game wasn't necessarily written for people to draw real-life comparisons, but I think the parallels here are what make Mirror's Edge's world and circumstances so fascinating. This concept, however, is made all the more enveloping through the game's distinctive art style, and the little details that appear throughout the game. First of all, the city, though unnamed, deliberately uses architecture very close to any major metropolitan city, taking from architecture and layouts around the world. Because of this contemporary feel, the game has an atmosphere about it that makes it feel like it could exist in my backyard, which contributes heavily to its believability. Alongside these buildings is a massive, postmodern piece of architecture simply called the Shard, which coincidentally shares a name with a real building in London, and even its look is somewhat similar. The glass paneling along its walls reflect the city's gloss, as described previously, and it is home to residential, shopping, and business areas, including the offices of the mayor. Much like the building in London, the Shard juts out and towers over the rest of the city's skyline, as if it sprung from the depths of hell. It almost feels like an eye in the sky as it reflects the entire city on its walls, bringing to mind the Eye of Sauron. The funniest part is that Mirror's Edge actually predates construction of the Shard in London by a few months, with the game even stating that its version of the Shard was completed in 2012. When was London's Shard completed? Take a guess. Another real-life parallel, though one that directly inspired Mirror's Edge, is Tokyo's underground discharge channel, which served as the basis for the entirety of the storm drain sequence in the chapter Jackknife. After platforming your way into a massive storm drain, you'll find yourself in the discharge channel, and what a staggeringly beautiful sight it is when the door lifts. It simultaneously holds this daunting yet incredibly exciting atmosphere. It towers over you, and yet you can scale it like it's nothing. And you'd be surprised, despite how uniform and linear the layout of this place is, the platforms surrounding each pillar create an incredibly tense and enjoyable sequence. This all contributes to Mirror's Edge's contemporary setting, and the parallels that can be drawn between it and our reality. Bringing the notion of the city being sanitized of crime is its overwhelming and loud absence of color across its various buildings and facilities, to the point where even the trees are artificial, with their leaves and trunks being completely white. The entire city has been wiped clean, sterilized of any life as a byproduct of cleansing all crime. Any and all color is reserved specifically for advertising and corporations, as if any use of color is meant to mark turf owned by those in power. Take, for example, the moment in which you burst into Robert Pope's office building. You're surrounded by an arid lack of color, pursuing those trademark red doors you're meant to burst through across the game. Once you finally make it there, you slam your way through the door and are met with an explosion of green, and suddenly the world feels alive again, all because Robert Pope works here. This kind of thing is a common occurrence throughout the game, and it is never any less satisfying to bear witness to. You'll also get to see plenty of instances of how color has been commandeered by people in power. Take a look at this section's use of the color blue. Along this route, you can see a logo for the company New Stream Energy. The use of orange is reserved for former wrestler and politician Travis Burfield, otherwise known as Ropeburn, as well as Pirandello Kruger, whom he was once employed by. Ropeburn also uses the color green in the boat chapter, stealing it away from Robert Pope after he is found dead in his office. Embedded in the colors used throughout the game are various advertisements that give insight into just how bleak things have become for this city. Apparently, cigarettes and alcohol have been made illegal, with an ad for a nicotine patch reading, "Don't break the law, patch up." There's a donut ad in the mall and in Centurion Plaza that proudly advertises its lack of the very ingredients that make donuts a treat to begin with. And there's an ad for a drink that apparently contains your 5-a-day vegetables in a single can. Then there's an ad that ties into the surveillance of the city itself, a mobile phone service called City Ear, and the slogan, "With our network, you are never alone." Additionally, the Shard itself, home to the offices of Mayor Callahan, is adorned with a Latin phrase that essentially translates to "the ends justify the means," pretty much explicitly telling any citizen disillusioned with the state of the city that this was all for the greater good. He also shut down a memorial for the riots out of fear for the exact same thing happening again.
I was too young to remember exactly how it started. The authorities said the changes were for the greater good. But good isn't the same as right.
While attempting to exact this overwhelming amount of control, you will only breed more resistance, and that's what the runners embody. The color red is almost non-existent when it comes to the city's use of color, instead being reserved specifically for runners. It can be seen on their clothing, and in a game mechanic known as runner's vision, as the color red dynamically appears on colorless obstacles and terrain in an attempt to maintain the game's flow state. The color red shows you exactly where you're supposed to go without telling you how exactly to get there. It'll appear on ladders, vents, boxes, railings, you name it. It even shows up on giant cranes. All that's left for you to do upon seeing the color is to use the abilities given to you to chase it down. To make this selective use of color pop against the white walls and floors, the team used global illumination to reflect color. As this game was developed long before ray-traced global illumination was possible on consumer-level hardware, all of the lighting was baked into each level, meaning that the team had to individually render each level before implementing their work. In contrast, Half-Life 2 also used baked lighting, which is why I felt its visuals held up for so long, but it was at a much lower resolution. Unreal Engine 3, the engine this game runs on, really let DICE run wild with their vision for the game, and 15 years on, its environments are still some of the best I've ever seen in a video game, due to both their simplicity and their use of global illumination. The duplicitous nature of this city is precisely what makes it so beautiful to me. A false, dystopian paradise. I mean, there's a mall called New Eden in this game. Granted, it is an absolutely gorgeous area, but it is also made up of colors meant to represent turf from different advertisers and corporations. A clash of colors representing an oppressive lack of freedom, with the mall carrying a biblical name in a vain attempt to seem like paradise. With how deliberate the art direction in this game is, and despite the team's insistence that it isn't meant to commentate on reality, places like Robert Pope's office complex or the subway or the Shard do actually mirror the look of places I used to visit all the time as a kid. They feel reminiscent of a design aesthetic that has largely fallen out of use since the 2010s came along. It looks as though the future has been imprinted on a contemporary office building. And to do that with such a simplistic use of color is incredible. Mirror's Edge was far ahead of its time. Equally as compelling as the city itself is Faith Connors, the game's protagonist. Orphaned by protests that turned violent, and discovered by the runner called Mercury, who serves as your accompaniment for the majority of the game as you run from one place to the next. Not only is Faith's design captivating, with the makeup around her eye forming the game's primary piece of iconography, she has a tough attitude that is subdued and not at all in your face about how she confronts the status quo in the city. She's pretty mellow despite her upbringing and circumstances, and she has this universal appeal without being abrasive or annoying in the slightest. Faith stands tall as an empowering and level-headed protagonist, and one of my favorites in video games altogether. Narratively speaking, though I love the world Mirror's Edge has crafted, I think the story of the game is a pretty episodic look into how things function, and while I would have been more than willing to see yet another dive into this world someday, ultimately, nothing established in this game was ever explored further, as Catalyst all but reset the game's continuity. The basic gist is that someone set up Faith's twin sister Kate to take the fall for Robert Pope's murder, and in an effort to unravel the conspiracy, she crosses paths with politicians, old friends, and new rivals. I won't give a full synopsis right now as I want to go through the game chapter by chapter, but the actual narrative isn't the most compelling aspect of the game's writing and world building. It is certainly decent enough though, its themes are great, and it exists as a byproduct of the world they've established. A lot of the impact of this game's world comes from its subtext and detail, but we'll talk more about the story and everything surrounding it as we go along. Additionally, the game's major cutscenes in between chapters are not animated in-engine. They're animated in 2D with a clean, edgeless style, reminiscent of something like 16 or those Esurance commercials from the 2000s. The animation is honestly a bit inconsistent here. Occasionally it looks pretty fluid, especially in the opening cutscene when it goes into a first-person perspective, but other times it's a bit awkward, and the characters move more like puppets than they do people. Stylistically, I don't really have a problem with them, in fact I think they're pretty slick, but I always wondered what the cutscenes would look like if they were animated in-engine. There's actually a model for Mercury in the game's files, but it goes entirely unused. I have to wonder if 2D animation is actually what they wanted to do here, or if they intended to animate the cutscenes in-engine at some point. Much like the game itself, the cutscenes are largely experimental, and if they were a deliberate decision regardless of their inconsistencies, I commend them for their effort. From here I want to walk through the game chapter by chapter in order to hopefully pass on my understanding of why this game's level design is so good, and highlight how these chapters are both fun challenges for those that only play the game once, and especially how they are exhilarating to memorize and master. I always really enjoyed this intro sequence, not just for how it showcases the game's art direction through a minimalist style, but because all of the moves that Faith performs in this scripted sequence are moves that you will eventually perform, all set to the game's theme song, Still Alive, albeit without lyrics. As you'd expect, this game's prologue chapter is pretty straightforward. Outdoor sequence, indoor sequence, then back outdoors again before it ends. but it provides a succinct introduction to the general flow of the game and the possibilities in Faith's moveset. You've got a small building here that leads to a zipline before a set of 2 buildings that have multiple methods of ascension. Climbing up the rightmost building before jumping over to the left one is something you would come to expect from a new player, but a faster way to ascend them is by wall running on the right one before turning and leaping to the roof of the left one, a technique that you will have picked up by the end of your first playthrough. This kind of thing is necessary if you want to escape from combat quickly or attempt speedruns, but it also allows you to look at problems in various ways and find your own method of solving them. Considering how much I love Super Mario 64's moveset and how it enabled different possibilities for obtaining stars, it's no wonder I fell in love with Mirror's Edge. Shortly after this is a sequence in which you drop down in front of a few cops, or blues as the runners like to call them. They open fire out of nowhere, so you have to suddenly book it. You can use the stairs to get out of here while they pursue you, but if you want to save some time, you can also run up the walls and then jump away from them to quickly ascend to your escape route. After this comes a steep jump in which you are encouraged to land a skill roll, as well as a silent tutorial on the advantages to maintaining the high ground when running through stages, as you can often jump between AC units and whatnot in order to find shortcuts that can save you time. Then comes the game's first real combat scenario. I won't lie, combat in Mirror's Edge is kind of awkward to get to grips with. You have a decent amount of tools at your disposal if you use the environment to your advantage and attack from different angles, but it is not exactly the game's strongest aspect. You can perform well with it though, and you also have a lot of ways in which to bypass combat altogether. For example, you can take a specific route through this area to largely avoid all gunfire and make it to Celeste, and there are routes like this all throughout the game if you know where to look for them. When it comes to those scenarios in which you feel like you have no choice but to fight, you have a few options for dealing with enemies quickly. First of all, you can quickly disarm an enemy by right-clicking their weapon as it turns red. That's right, runner vision actually applies to weapons too. The encounter with Ropeburn in his chapter explicitly forces you to disarm him in order to continue with the rest of the game. If you're having trouble with the timing, there is an additional mechanic that you can use called reaction time. Think of it like bullet time in Max Payne, as it slows down time and allows you to make more precise movements. The kicker is that it also slows down the timer in speedruns and time trials, so it is beneficial no matter what level of skill you have at this game. Once you have an enemy's gun, you can either shoot the rest of the enemies with it, or if you're doing a pacifist run, you can dispose of it before tackling another enemy. There's an additional achievement for completing Mirror's Edge without firing a shot at anyone, allowing you to maintain Faith's origins of being the daughter of a peaceful protester. And no, that time she kicked a cop off of some scaffolding as he fell to his death doesn't count. The fall killed him, not Faith. When it comes to actual CQC, you can punch enemies straight on, slide kick them from a jump, land on them. You have plenty of options if they have their guard up. All the while, you can use the dodge for its intended purpose, rather than just using it to get to your top speed like I've been doing throughout this video. Again, combat is not this game's strongest suit, but it gives you plenty of ways to deal with enemies quickly, or in most cases, ignore them entirely. Either way, that's the prologue for Mirror's Edge. You leap onto and hang from a news helicopter, and gaze into the reflection of the building you just leapt from. A great way to kick things off, and thanks to its brisk pace and variety, the best chapter to practice speedrunning. The next chapter, Flight, establishes a similar flow state to the prologue, with a lack of any slow, methodical problem solving, instead focusing on chase sequences and problems you have to solve quickly with your abilities, like when you have to ascend to the vent in Pope's offices, or cross the gap in these buildings to reach a fire escape, all while being chased and shot at. In addition to the tension this chapter creates, and the euphoria of playing this chapter well, making you feel like James Bond at the beginning of Casino Royale, the chapter just looks gorgeous. As I mentioned previously, the harsh contrast as you barge through Pope's office is sensational, and the underground sections of Centurion Plaza use color in pretty remarkable ways. The next chapter is Jackknife, named after Faith's old acquaintance, whom she's tracking down in order to unravel this conspiracy to frame her sister. Immediately you begin with a more methodical climbing sequence that plays into an incredibly important skill, being able to jump accurately between pipes and ledges. You'll need this skill when descending and ascending the storm drains, you'll need it in order to reach Jackknife at the end of the chapter, and you'll need it throughout the rest of the game. With very little solid ground to stand on, suddenly Mirror's Edge shifts from being a game about traversing different platforms quickly, to being Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time in first person. To be honest, a lot of Mirror's Edge's design extends to that notion, but it really shines through when you have to make more delicate movements and decisions. These are climbing segments with purpose and impact, something that has since been lost on a lot of AAA games that feature climbing today. The mechanic has been diluted to the point where they feel more like filler or a loading screen for whatever is coming next, as if these games learned the wrong lessons from Prince of Persia. Despite this shift, the chapter still features a lot of tension and adrenaline-pumping sequences, particularly in the massive discharge channel, and once you ascend from the storm drain and have to jump a barbed wire fence while avoiding gunfire. The chase with Jackknife is also pretty fun, and it might even teach you a few things regarding cleaner movement, but it is kind of hilarious because he often pauses to wait for you to catch up, so there's no real penalty for being slow here. The next chapter is Heat, and it mixes both slower problem solving and quick thinking into its flow state, for a fun chapter to run through. It was inside of these offices here that I think I fully came to grips with the benefit of tucking my legs in to save time. Once you come to this section here with the glass paneling on the wall, things ramp up in intensity. You have to do what you've been doing while being chased by dudes with guns and a helicopter. This chapter is one of the few combat scenarios that I swear you have no choice but to confront head on. The fastest way to do this is to just disarm one enemy and shoot the others, but if you're doing a pacifist run, you'll have to be a bit more creative in order to take care of them quickly, which means timing your counters just right, jumping off of walls to kick them from above, just about anything you can think of. Like I've said, though combat is not this game's strongest aspect, they give you the tools necessary in order to use combat as little as possible. After this comes one of the game's coolest sequences. First, you'll have to make your way through the scaffolding, which is structured kind of similarly to the running you had to do in the storm drains, and it's a lot of fun to go through quickly. Then you'll come to a construction crane that is painted red, upon which I'm sure you'll know what to do. It's time to do some James Bond shit. Next is Rope Burn, in which you first need to disable an electric fence by going around it on an adjacent building. Then comes an indoor sequence of climbing before you are greeted by none other than the man himself. This is the forced parry sequence I mentioned earlier. As you get some information out of him, you attempt to lift him up before someone shoots him in the hand, and he falls to his death. The chapter immediately ramps up in intensity from here, and you might begin to notice a pattern in how these chapters are structured. Slow, more methodical running, followed by a sudden shift in pressure. Then we transition out of it for another more careful sequence, in this case a trip into the subway, wash, rinse, repeat, all topped off with a climactic and memorable sequence that utilizes the environment or a character in a unique way. It sounds formulaic when I break it down this way, but this kind of pacing is just the framework for the designers to slot in any wild gameplay scenario they can come up with, and they are almost always fun to go through. Couple this with the joy of using Faith's moveset to move through these levels as swiftly as possible, and the satisfaction in conquering challenges like they're nothing, and you have what is essentially a playable action film with some of the most compelling and rewarding platforming I've ever experienced when you attempt subsequent runs, and there's still plenty of game left for us to cover. This chapter closes out with a slew of subway shenanigans, including running from gunfire or dismantling it depending on what makes you more comfortable, a quick puzzle involving an emergency override switch, and Scruffy the Rat, who has a single 2-second animation that loops perpetually, a more involved puzzle that has you disable the fans and run as fast as you can to make it through in time, before the climax of the chapter has you jumping onto a moving subway train, dodging debris, jumping to another train, and getting the hell out of the subway tunnel before another train arrives to run you over. Man, if you weren't afraid of getting hit by a train before this chapter, you will be. What an awesome chapter this is, and it remains solid even as you attempt to speedrun it, despite the claustrophobic level design at times, and the trains being a bit of a rogue element during runs. It utilizes the framework the team established for each chapter to the fullest extent. Before we talk about the next chapter, I want to shed light on what is probably my favorite cutscene in the game. After meeting up with Celeste at the end of the last chapter, the two of them have coffee on a rooftop as the sun rises. Faith sheds light on her devotion to her sister, the only family she has left, and how Mercury was the one that gave her a job after he caught her stealing equipment from him. Faith is always on the move, always trying to do the right thing, always surviving. To which Celeste opines that survival is overrated, and that she needs to live a little too. I always took interest in how this city's authoritarian regime has had an effect on both of them. And though it might only seem like a quaint little cutscene now, their differing views on life will come into play soon enough. The next chapter revolves around the tastelessly named New Eden Mall. The flow state of this chapter is similar to previous ones, so I won't go over its design at the risk of sounding redundant. You're dodging trains, gunfire, and solving problems with your abilities till you reach the mall itself. This mall has a wonderful amalgamation of color across its various walls, as I've mentioned, as malls are typically central hubs for shopping and commerce. It's no wonder each color has staked a claim in this place. It also plays with global illumination in gorgeous ways. Check out this area here that is dark save for the lights on the ground. Such a moody lighting setup that is easy to miss, but it reminds me of going into places I'd spent so much time in during childhood at night, when all the lights are off and there's no one around. It feels like a completely different building. The mall also balances some open-ended level design with sequences in which I always feel completely naked, no matter how many times I go through them. There are an overwhelming amount of guns pointed at you at seemingly all times, and this sequence at the end in which you have to cross over the top of the atrium is genuinely terrifying. You have to make this jump, otherwise you're starting over from a checkpoint, and during speedruns, that is not a mistake you can afford to make. You can see how speedruns just amplify the risk and tension of these scenarios. These kinds of situations also showcase why the trial and error present on your first playthrough of Mirror's Edge might discourage you from wanting to pursue anything beyond a single playthrough. On your first time through the game, you will be confronted with plenty of scenarios where you just kinda have to fail and then learn what to do next, like when you have to make quick decisions in platforming, and especially in combat. You'll die and have to do the section over again, which becomes a huge pace breaker in a game about achieving a sense of flow in your actions. Only now that time has passed, and people have had their fun with the time trials and speedruns, including me, have I been able to achieve that sense of flow in a single run. Sure, I die here and there, but the kind of experience that I think DICE was hoping to achieve is only truly possible when you pour time into this game, perfecting every inch of it. And I am more than okay with that. The design of this game is so clear and focused, not to mention exhilarating once you master it, that I don't mind coming back to it again and again. This is on top of everything I've already mentioned that I love about this game. Next is Pirandello Kruger, the chapter with the most confusing level design in the game. Between climbing around the outskirts of the building to actually solve this maze-like layout as you attempt to access one of the blocked-off rooms, and as you scale these massive storage areas with the intended path as conveyed through runner vision not entirely obvious to you, this level will constantly keep you guessing. It breaks up the pace of the game quite a bit, though I'll admit, I see the merit in doing a chapter like this in between the fast-paced dynamic structure of each chapter preceding it. Otherwise, this awesome framework they've established would slowly dilute itself. I don't particularly enjoy fighting the armored guys here, though. They are a nightmare to deal with on a pacifist run. Also, you can find an email written by none other than Christian Plowforce here, my alter ego. The chapter closes out with the revelation that Project Icarus actually refers to a program in which the city has been training their own runners to shut runners down entirely and gain full control of the city. This shot of the training grounds looks photorealistic. I still can't believe that this game was released in 2008. The rest of the chapter has you running from these mysterious people, meaning that you have to move especially fast, as they are just as formidable as you at this whole gameplay loop. So much fun, and a great way to close out a chapter primarily focused on puzzle solving. Next comes Boat, and I'll let you guess where its name comes from. It takes place at night, meaning we get to see this game's global illumination techniques shine in a darker lighting setup, and it looks beautiful. This first alley is lit up in blue thanks to the paint surrounding it. Though I don't love the portion of this chapter that forces you into combat, as this door necessary to progress is surrounded by armored enemies, this chapter is incredible at slowly building tension. Let me properly shed light on Solar Field's original score for this game. It is entirely electronic, yet it holds a ton of range and is just as dynamic as the game's design and flow state. It can go from sweeping ambient pieces to pulsing, harsh electronic combat music that, despite its ethereal sound, is still firmly rooted in the false sense of paradise the city has created. I always loved the score for the New Eden chapter, as it has this glossy serenity about it through the platforming sections of the chapter. Until it erupts into an explosion of this blood-pumping electronic instrumentation. That said, I wanted to highlight the score for this chapter in particular, as it absolutely defines the atmosphere. The chapter opens with what sounds like a foghorn, droning as it continues.
Sounds like it's time for a little stowaway action, Faith. Quick, before it goes.
It lingers until you reach your first combat arena. It carries this cinematic feeling, until you eventually find yourself platforming around in a tight space, upon which it retreats back into that foghorn ambience, even as you meet with the sniper above the deck. Finally, after seeing this mysterious runner snipe Ropeburn and give you the slip in the New Eden Mall, after the stuff Kate has had to endure, and Robert Pope's death leaving a lasting effect on runners and the city at large, you have a straight shot toward answers. You have to stick to cover to avoid getting shot as best you can, before you end up in a combat encounter which, I'll admit, does feel like you're flailing around until you can land a counter and disarm them. Once you do, they'll break your grab and run off, and thus begins the final chase sequence of the chapter. And unlike Jackknife, you can in fact lose the chase and have to start over. Though on the whole I don't love this chapter, and although this portion is short, this sequence is so brilliantly crafted. You have to perform some top-notch running to keep up, the level design throws you twists along the way, and the score for this sequence is sublime. It feels so good to finally be pursuing this person, whoever they might be. As it turns out, it's Celeste. Not the most shocking twist or anything, but it does reveal just how and why her and Faith's philosophies differed. Celeste colluded with Project Icarus as she wanted to live, not just survive. The way I see it, the illusions of grandeur about this city are shown to be able to seduce just about anyone, should they eventually grow frail and tired from running. Thematically, this is something that I've seen explored in punk fiction a lot, but rarely in a setting that seems equal parts dystopian and contemporary. In reality, a lot of people are fighting to survive in a city that presents itself as glamorous and comfortable, and this game portrays actual comfort and security as something you can not only buy your way into, but also something that you can obtain if you are willing to sacrifice who you are and what you stand for, rather than fighting tooth and nail to earn a better life. I think that's why I always found their differing philosophies so profound. It's not that this game's actual narrative is particularly compelling, nor does it have the character-driven drama of The Last of Us, for example. It stands on its own two legs as an episodic look into a dystopian city not too far removed from one in our own reality, both visually and thematically. The next chapter, Kate, begins with Faith pursuing her sister after she is found guilty, for the crime that she did not commit. You'll be pursued by runners for the city, and you'll have to make quick decisions in order to outrun them. The platforming from here is a lot less obvious to the player, and achieving that sense of flow in this chapter, for me, came from doing the time trials that focused on the level design in this chapter. Here I found that I could run up both this building and the scaffolding next to it to get to the high ground quickly, just from experimenting with the level design in the time trials. Where this comes to a head, however, is in the unfinished atrium made up of scaffolding. After things die down and you solve a perilous little platforming challenge, you'll ride up an elevator to an atrium under construction. You might remember this area from the beginning of the video. This is, in my opinion, the greatest piece of level design in the entire game. You have to use all of your abilities in order to figure out how to scale this place, and as you climb higher, the footing gets less and less generous. It's not only an incredible bit of level design, but when attempting to do this as quickly as possible, it showcases Mirror's Edge's gameplay at its finest. It's tight, it's endlessly rewarding as you come up with little time saves, and the music in this area just builds more and more as you climb higher and higher. The music in this place also ended up being reused as the piece that plays after you complete a time trial, almost psychologically pushing you towards getting better and better, and reaching that sense of flow in every single part of this game. From here, you stop Kate's car from taking her to prison, before rushing down the stairs to it while being shot at from every direction. You don't have to fight the enemies or take the stairs directly, there are many ways for you to get down here safely and swiftly. Sadly, before the final chapter takes place, Merc is killed. This means that in your trip to the Shard, you are alone for the first time. This final chapter is, as you'd expect, the hardest chapter in the game, as they unleash as much gunfire as they can on you. There are multiple open-ended areas and platforming challenges that ask you to think carefully about where you put your feet. The first arena unleashes an entire army on you, and you have to either disarm them one by one, or find a way to hit the elevator button amidst all of the shit being thrown at you. The next arena is a typical platforming challenge, though you have multiple snipers trained on you, so you'll need to somehow stick to cover as you did in the storm drains and the chase with Celeste. The final arena is about as close to a final boss as you can get with a game like this. Basically, you have to take out all 4 of these cores either by baiting enemy gunfire or by shooting them out yourself. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is reaching the door to get the hell out of here after the cores have been destroyed, as you have a straightaway with an armored guy standing there, LMG in his hands, while all of the other officers are surrounding you and can shoot you extremely easily. Out of all the sections in Mirror's Edge, this is not only where I feel the most naked, but it's also where I die the most without question. Doing this section fast feels like pure luck a lot of the time, and doing it without shooting anyone is miserable. Probably the worst area in the entire game, gonna be honest. Interestingly enough, I don't think this was meant to be the end. In the final cutscene in which Jackknife is revealed to be a part of Project Icarus as well, the helipad has a ton of geometry, and that's because this was intended to be a massive encounter to close out the game, complete with tons of enemies, runners, and Jackknife taunting you throughout. In fact, you can run around this part of the level if you pick the Shard 2 time trial. Look at how much is going on here, and yet it was entirely scrapped, seemingly at the last minute. AI path nodes exist in the game's files for an encounter like this, and this explains the fact that the PK guys disappear after the cutscene with Jackknife ends. There is a mod that restores this part of the chapter to a mostly playable state, but it's a shame that the ending of this game is pretty anticlimactic. That being said, it ends just as it began, with Faith jumping onto a helicopter. Kate is saved, and we hear the game's theme song for the first time. Thus ends the main story for Mirror's Edge. In a news report during the credits, it is revealed that Faith's actions made little impact on the city itself, only serving to further strengthen security. The news even tells citizens to limit their cell phone and internet usage until security can be put in place. Either way, Faith and Kate's whereabouts are unknown. Can't wait for the sequel, guys. I'll be there. As I've said, the story itself isn't what makes Mirror's Edge so compelling to play through. It's the world, the subtext of its narrative, and the fact that the levels are rich in methods of approach and how you can endlessly optimize your movement. Let's extrapolate further on what the time trials bring to this game. Each time trial takes you through a bite-sized portion of the game's levels, and you can obtain a rating of up to 3 stars. The 3-star requirements are often incredibly strict and ask you to both look at levels differently in order to save time, finding different routes and time saves along the way through experimentation, and you also have to optimize your movement to the point where you are constantly on the move, not slowing down for a single moment. It's incredibly rewarding, but also where the vast majority of your playtime with this game will come from, should you choose to perfect your gameplay. The time trials will inform your gameplay on subsequent playthroughs of Mirror's Edge, and you're meant to apply what you've learned in order to tackle the speedrun mode, in which the par times for each chapter are relentlessly strict. This was where I began to see the levels in Mirror's Edge in an entirely new light. They were no longer about trial and error. I had a clear path that I needed to take, and it was up to me in order to figure out how to take that path as fast as I could. I had to think about what moves to use, and where I could potentially do some sick freerunning. Because of this, I was able to truly embody Faith in my repeat playthroughs of Mirror's Edge. I felt like a pro runner, and that's why I keep coming back to this game. It gives me a feeling unlike anything else I've ever played. Its solid focus and its fascinating world have led to me craving playthroughs of the game more than once a year. I just find it so damn fun to play well. Much like speedrunning Super Mario 64 after having a solid grasp on its movement. That focus on its addictive gameplay and improvement, paired with my love of its totalitarian setting, have led to it becoming one of my favorite games of all time. Despite how punishing its requirements are for the best times, the experience I gained getting to that point, and the euphoria I've achieved now that I can string all of these moves together for a perfect run, has been some of the most fun I've had with a game. It's a shame that this foundation they established never received any more work. The game's follow-up 8 years later was not at all in the same vein. Unfortunately, Mirror's Edge never received a direct sequel. Footage from a prototype for that sequel leaked a while ago, following in the original game's wake, but we instead received a soft reboot in 2016. I liked aspects of the game, and I do firmly believe they had something special on their hands, but a lot of baffling decisions made me vastly prefer the original. For starters, a lot of the original team did not return to work on Catalyst. A lot of the team at DICE that worked on this game was made up of new blood, which is fine, but it certainly meant that we weren't getting a game that aimed to be a proper follow-up to the original. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is an open-world game, but the main missions in this game are completely segmented from the world itself, leading to a game that feels like it is caught between two structures. Let me explain. The open world in this game, in all honesty, is where the game is at its best. Using all of Faith's moves to collect stuff and complete side missions where you have to move as fast as possible is always great fun. It delivers on a sense of freedom that the original game carried with it when you nailed its movement. Things do get repetitive if you choose to pursue them, but they utilize the open world's design far better than the main game does. That is to say, the main game doesn't utilize the world at all, because the levels are completely segmented from it. Additionally, the experience you gain from doing this contributes to a skill tree that is ultimately one of the most underwhelming and frustrating I've ever experienced in a game from the 2010s. The biggest problem with it is that it locks moves that Faith had in her initial moveset from the first game behind certain levels, meaning that you have to unlock the skill roll, coil, quick turn, and the double wall run. Their explanation for this was that it was intended to gradually dole out Faith's moveset so that players acclimate to her possibilities in a more organic fashion. And I agree with the logic of that statement, but these moves are so fundamental to playing Mirror's Edge that I cannot fathom why you would need to reserve slots on a skill tree for them. Though you will unlock them pretty quickly, the rest of the skills feel like pointless upgrades that you shouldn't have to earn. Abilities like the extended slide and climbing efficiency bonuses are so minor that I question why a skill tree even exists in this game at all. This ain't no Diablo, folks. You're not going to be getting creative with builds and whatnot in this game. This is a typical 2010s open world game that uses a skill tree as an arbitrary and uninspired method of doling out upgrades. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but I am so sick of seeing these in games today. You can also upgrade your combat and gadget capabilities, but these feel like such an arbitrary way to make Faith gradually become stronger over the course of the game. In the first game, becoming stronger was entirely dependent on the player. Using every move to your advantage was something you became able to do through good old-fashioned experience. It doesn't help that combat in this game just kinda sucks throughout. They lock you into combat scenarios often, and you have to spam a few moves over and over in order to break through enemy armor when necessary, and then finally take them down. Combat is only optional in the open world. During the main story, you pretty much always have to fight when they introduce an arena with enemies. On the other hand, the main missions lack the depth that the chapters in the first game carried, because they aren't built for speedrunning multiple times. I mean, the problem solving and quick decision making you come to expect from Mirror's Edge is here and accounted for. They are great levels by themselves. Catalyst's interpretation of the Shard was so much fun to ascend, and it's pretty challenging. But you can't ever revisit these levels upon completing them. And because they aren't baked into the open world itself, there's no opportunity for the developers to build on the possibilities for approaching each level beyond your initial run through them. This is why I've always felt that if they merged these two disparate structures into one open-world game, with missions driven by the complexity of the open world itself, the game could have been something special. Though EA shut the multiplayer servers for this game down, Catalyst had an asynchronous multiplayer feature in which you could create your own races for other players to take part in around the city. These races taught me far more than I could have anticipated about how to approach the world, and I learned so much about shortcuts and alternate routes through these races that they only served to further confuse me over why this game is structured the way it is. And now, it's all gone. EA took one of the game's most compelling features offline. To accentuate this issue, I always had a ton of fun collecting grid leaks when they spawned in a new area of the city. I don't know what it is about them. Perhaps it's because they ask me to think about how to use my moves to my advantage, much like the original game's time trials did. I became obsessed with collecting them, even though there isn't much reward for doing so, and the races helped me to find new ways of reaching them. I have to wonder what total non-linearity would do for this game in a manner akin to Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring. Obviously hindsight is 2020, but imagine piecing together the city's stories by yourself, without any objective markers or segmented levels. Imagine solving problems in your own way through Faith's moveset, using the things that races created by other players did. Imagine if you could find things in the world that enabled you to do more, rather than unlocking them through experience on a skill tree. Imagine if this world wasn't just made up of a bunch of objective markers. A while ago I played a mod for the original Mirror's Edge that essentially prototyped an open-world version of that game, and it achieved exactly the type of game that I just described. If Catalyst was built on this foundation, I'd have to wonder how my feelings on the game would have shaken out. If you want to try this mod out for yourself, the link is in the description. All of this is why I felt Catalyst was caught between two structures, two identities. It is both a pale shadow of the game that came before it, and it fails to fully embrace the new game that it tried to become. The story didn't interest me in the slightest, as the characters felt entirely one-dimensional, with the exception of Faith herself, who honestly felt like the only character that was ever making any sense. I'm not going to argue that the story in the original game was amazing or anything, but it at least existed on the back of an immaculately crafted contemporary setting, so the subtext carried it in a lot of ways. Catalyst, on the other hand, while an absolutely gorgeous game in its own right, leaned heavily into a science fiction dystopia for its false paradise, complete with flying cars and futuristic technology, rather than something that could very well exist in our backyard. I found it very difficult to connect with this game in the same way as a result, not just because of its design problems, but because of its world not carrying the same deliberate vibe. For example, the art direction in the original game was so crystal clear and focused that when the DLC levels came out, they boiled the art direction down to its finest elements, and you could still tell from looking at it that it screamed Mirror's Edge. The City of Glass, though beautiful in its own way, is not nearly as focused as its predecessor, not visually, nor in terms of gameplay or structure. The most fun I had with this game only came after I finished the main story. I installed an assload of mods and just explored the city for fun, listening to music, picking up grid leaks, and competing in races along the way. I even installed a mod that let me revisit levels from the main campaign, and their design, while not as intricate as the original game, still very well could have provided a level of depth through time trials and whatnot. And yet, they were used once and discarded thereafter. I didn't think Catalyst was a bad game by any means, but I did find it to be baffling and underwhelming. I don't doubt that the original design of Mirror's Edge was shelved for an open-world game because of EA themselves. People are already pretty stingy with their money when it comes to full-price games, so EA likely wanted the game to feel like it was worth the average consumer's money. Not only that, but they just don't value single-player games nearly as much as they do the things that print them money these days. It's ironic that a company with the name Electronic Arts would become one of the most notorious corporations for undermining this medium's value as a form of artistic expression. It's unlikely that we'll ever get a game like Mirror's Edge again, but that is precisely what makes it so special. Mirror's Edge dared to be something completely original, and it experimented, only finding true success with those that put more time into it, because they wanted to feel empowered. To this day, it makes a bold statement in the industry through its rock-solid vision, showcasing what a short length and a focus on linearity can do for a game when it is well-designed and endlessly replayable. There will always be merit in designing a game like this, and all I can do is plead for a future where AAA games continue to be as creative and rewarding as Mirror's Edge. Please let artists create what they want. Only by taking risks have we been able to bear witness to this industry's evolution. I think the experimental, strongly unique vision of Mirror's Edge has served as a foundational inspiration for me moving forward. The point I'm at now with this game proved to me that I can do anything if I set my mind to it, and getting to that point makes the journey more than worth it. Like, I wasn't just given a YouTube channel. I worked at it as often as I could until I could make it a career. The same goes for other artistic pursuits I continue to follow. I continue to improve at them in an effort to not just be proud of what I can do, but also just to enjoy myself. I apply this philosophy to a lot of what I do today, especially in a world where artistic expression is being stifled by automation and money, as if the artist is being taken out of art itself. And that's why I'll just tell you to keep going. Get good enough at something so that you can be proud of what you've accomplished. If not art, then find some other way to leave your mark. Anything you're passionate about. Even if it's tough. Even if there are times where you don't think you can do it. Even if the world feels like it doesn't want you to succeed. Don't ever give up. For your sake. You'll be surprised at how your choices and perseverance can pay off in the end. I've been Liam Triforce. I love Mirror's Edge. Thanks so much for watching this video. Believe it or not, I've wanted to make this video for about 4 years now, and a lot of the gameplay you've seen in it, especially for Catalyst and the time trials, was recorded in 2020. Yeah. If you're wondering why I sound different, that's because I'm recording this outro on one of Antlion Audio's microphones, which they sent me for this promotion. This one is the Mod Mic USB 2, and the idea behind it is to have a broadcast-level microphone that you can simply attach to any pair of headphones, with an adhesive that just sticks right on. Because of that, you can attach it to anything, really. It features improved noise rejection over previous models, and it isn't just compatible with computers. This model comes with a USB-C adapter for use with your phone, a Nintendo Switch, a Steam Deck, or other mobile devices, and it's also compatible with the PS4 and PS5 out of the box. There are other models available, including the Mod Mic Wireless, which uses Bluetooth, eliminating the need for an additional wire, and the Mod Mic Uni 2, which uses an aux connection. On screen now is a breakdown of all of the features in each unit, so you can decide which one is right for you if you're interested. Check the link in the description to learn more. Thanks again to Antlion Audio for sponsoring this video. I've been Liam Triforce. Thanks for watching.